Generally speaking, Soviet MBTs have a pretty impressive reputation. For quite some time, they were not only more numerous than NATO tanks, but were also a bit more advanced. Of course, the Cold War was also rife with propaganda, so there are a lot of myths and misunderstandings surrounding Soviet MBTs, being both positive and negative. So we're going to be taking a look at myths from both sides. We won't be going in any particular order. It's also worth noting that when I say MBT, I'm generally talking about post-war tanks, whether they were technically classed as a medium or MBT. First up, it's often said that when Soviet MBTs were designed, no consideration was given to survivability. Depending on how you look at this one, it could be considered a half-truth. For Western tanks like the M1 and Leopard 2, they have blowout panels. If the ammunition is struck, there's a good chance they'll survive, because the resulting explosion will be vented away. Soviet MBTs have no measures like that. If the ammunition is struck, it almost always means there's a large explosion. Soviet tanks are famous for launching their turrets into the air. It is true that after the tank is penetrated, there are basically no survivability measures in place, but Soviet engineers took more of a proactive approach, rather than reactive. Statistically speaking, if you put the ammo low down in the hull, that's the safest layout you can have. By keeping the MBT as small as possible, you not only make it easier to transport and recover, but you can have thicker armor as well. Think of it this way, if you look at the survivability onion, they really emphasize the do not be penetrated part, and for a while it would have worked. I remember watching a film made for M60 crews. It was made when they were still using heat. When tasked with fighting a Soviet MBT, the advice given was basically this: just keep shooting low until it blows up. Doesn't exactly inspire confidence, does it? But NATO countries, especially the US, weren't going to let their forces be steamrolled. The US Army made rapid advances in anti-tank technology, to the point that they could reliably center mass the majority of Soviet MBTs. At that point, their plan kinda fell apart. You can gain survivability through extra armor, but once the armor is overmatched, it is basically useless. In modern conflicts with even more advanced anti-tank weapons, it's easy to point and laugh at how easily they blow up, but there's one thing that's important to remember. They're operating far outside their intended time frame and role. I'm not saying these MBTs are fine the way they are, but context is important. Next, let's take a look at that statement from the intro. I said that compared to NATO tanks, Soviet MBTs were better for quite some time, but some people believe that they were universally better. The Cold War is typically boiled down like this: the Soviets had the best tanks, and NATO had the best aircraft. This is generalizing quite a bit. In terms of material sciences, NATO was typically ahead, but the Soviets had novel ways of working around this. Superiority in either field wasn't constant for any one side. For instance, towards the end of the Cold War, NATO tanks were more advanced. The Soviets still beat them in sheer production numbers, but NATO believed that they could beat quantity with quality. A good example would be thermal tank sights. With the M60A3 TTS, the US had the first thermal tank sight, and every M1 had a thermal sight right off the production line. The Soviets had prototypes with thermal sights, and did make a few production vehicles, but they had difficulty producing them in numbers. Russia still has that problem today. They purchased their sights from a French company. Soviet fire control systems were extremely advanced initially, but eventually, Western FCSs caught up and surpassed them. It's commonly said that Soviet equipment is inherently reliable. The most famous example of this is the AK pattern of rifle, but it's often said for Soviet tanks as well. This isn't really the case. As tanks typically do, most Soviet MBTs had teething issues, and they were gradually fixed over time. However, when it comes to certain tanks like the T-55 and T-62, tanks lauded for their reliability, they were actually less reliable than some NATO counterparts. That isn't to say they weren't reliable overall. They likely met Soviet standards, but saying they're inherently more reliable, that would be incorrect. When judging vehicles, it really should be done on a case-by-case basis. And finally, Soviet autoloaders. I've talked about this before, but a decent number of you guys probably didn't see that video. The myth says they eat the limbs of crew members. I looked into this pretty extensively, and I could only find one vehicle where this kind of thing happened. On the BMP-1, the autoloader could injure the gunner, but it was hardly taking entire limbs. By and large, it wasn't really an issue. If the crew ignores safety measures, autoloaders can cause harm, but that's also true for many tank components. If you're manually loading around, having your thumb in the wrong place can make you lose it. Anyway, that's pretty much all I've got to say. If you guys have myths you want me to cover, leave it in a comment. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.